This is one of those questions that sounds almost too obvious to ask until you actually start digging into the specifics, and then it turns into one of the most genuinely fascinating rabbit holes in maritime history. Imagine this. You're an ancient sailor standing at the helm of a wooden ship. Your only companion's the vast expanse of ocean and the endless sky above. You have no compass, no GPS, no detailed map, just the horizon stretching out like a mysterious, uncharted promise. Here's where it gets intriguing. How in the world did these sailors successfully navigate such treacherous waters without the tools we consider essential today? Do ancient sailors genuinely navigate without maps? And if so, why does this happen with such precision across different seafaring cultures? Let's dive into our first concept, celestial navigation, or what some scholars refer to as the star track method. This was a fundamental technique where sailors used the sun, moon, planets, and stars to determine their position and heading. Essentially, by measuring the angle between these celestial bodies and the horizon, often using an instrument called an astrolabe, sailors could pinpoint their latitude. For instance, the Polynesians, who were among the most skilled navigators, could voyage across thousands of miles in the Pacific Ocean by reading the night sky. Their accuracy was astonishing, with journeys spanning over 2,000 miles without any errors that we can quantify today. Let's consider a different example: the Vikings. Known for their fearsome expeditions, they were also master navigators. They developed the Sunstone Method, using a crystal to locate the sun even on overcast days. This allowed them to maintain a steady course across the North Atlantic, covering distances of up to 1,500 miles with remarkable precision. Now this raises a perplexing point. What about on cloudy nights when stars are hidden? This sounds like it completely contradicts everything we just said. But these ancient mariners adapted by memorizing ocean currents and prevailing winds, which are surprisingly consistent. These natural signs offered a way to navigate when the sky wasn't visible, adding an extra layer to their navigation toolkit. Understanding celestial navigation helps us see just how sophisticated these methods were in addressing the fundamental question of navigation. But here's the kicker. How did they even know which stars to trust for their journey in the first place? That brings us to a fascinating concept known as star lore, often called cultural astronomy. This involves the stories and folklore that gave sailors a framework to interpret the stars. Over generations, knowledge about reliable stars and constellations was passed down, embedded in myths and legends. The Greeks, for example, used myths to remember the constellations, like Orion the Hunter, whose belt pointed the way to the east. Then there's the case of the Aboriginal Australians, who used a complex system of oral traditions to remember star paths for crossing their vast continent. For them, constellations like the emu in the sky were not just stars, but vital waypoints in their journeys, an approach stretching over 60,000 years that still informs their cultural astronomy today. However, what happens when cultures with no written records, like the Pacific Islanders, lack tangible stories for reference? Well, these cultures often relied on what's known as star compasses, mental maps of the night sky that didn't require stories, but instead used direct star observations to navigate with precision. Star lore helps us understand the cultural dimension of navigation, yet it leads us to ponder another question. How did sailors manage to keep a consistent direction over long distances without a compass? Enter the concept of dead reckoning, sometimes referred to as navigational math. This was a method of calculating one's current position by using a previously determined position and then advancing that position based upon known or estimated speeds over elapsed time and course. This method was essential for ancient sailors lacking sophisticated tools. For instance, if a sailor knew they had traveled at 10 knots for 3 hours on a heading of north-northeast, they could estimate their new position relative to their starting point. Take the case of the ancient Greeks, who used this method extensively in the Mediterranean Sea. By keeping meticulous logs of speed and direction, They could traverse their intricate trade routes, sailing distances of up to 500 miles without losing their way. But then you might wonder, how did they accurately measure speed without modern instruments? Well, this brings us to knotted ropes, a tool that originated with the Phoenicians, where sailors would drop a rope with knots tied at regular intervals over the side of the ship and count how many knots passed through their fingers in a given time, typically measured by a sandglass. Dead reckoning underscores the meticulous nature of ancient navigation, yet it does beg the question, how did they adapt when crossing vast uncharted waters like the oceanic voyages of the Polynesians? This brings us to the technique known as wave piloting, which some researchers call ocean swell reading. This method involved reading ocean swells to navigate. Mariners could determine direction and nearby land by analyzing the patterns and directions of waves. Remarkably, Pacific Islanders were so adept that they could detect changes in wave patterns to find islands beyond the horizon. A vivid example is the traditional navigators of the Marshall Islands, who used stick charts, which represented wave patterns and island positions. These charts weren't maps in the traditional sense, but were more like guides to understanding the dynamic nature of the ocean swells, enabling them to travel across hundreds of miles of open sea. Yet, here's a twist. What about when waves are disrupted by storms? Interestingly, experienced navigators could even use the positioning of birds, such as the flight patterns of frigate birds, which rarely stray far from land, as an additional input to navigate through turbulent waters. Wave piloting highlights the incredible observational skills of ancient seafarers, but it leads us to question, how did they transmit this knowledge across generations so accurately? This is where oral tradition, known also as mnemonic histories, comes into play. These were the verbal records used to transmit navigation techniques and knowledge over centuries. In many cultures, special ceremonies or rituals were conducted where young navigators learned these oral maps from elder seafarers, ensuring the continuity of navigation skills. For example, the Polynesians conducted wayfinding schools, where students learned the chants and songs that contained critical navigation knowledge, such as which stars rose and set at what latitude and season. These schools were essential, considering the voyages could span distances as far as 4,000 miles. A slightly different approach can be seen with the Norse sagas, which, although often mythologized, provided valuable navigational information about known routes and landmarks. These stories, while entertaining, contained critical wayfinding details that could be recalled during a journey. The reliance on oral tradition shows how critical the oral transmission of knowledge was. But it raises yet another question. What happened when different navigational cultures met and shared knowledge? This introduces the concept of cross-cultural navigation exchange, sometimes termed nautical syncretism. When different cultures encountered each other through trade or exploration, they often exchanged navigational techniques and knowledge, blending different methods to enhance their maritime prowess. A notable instance was the encounter between Arab and Indian sailors in the Indian Ocean. The Arabs introduced the kamal, a celestial navigation tool, to Indian navigators, who combined it with their knowledge of monsoon winds to improve their trade routes, covering distances up to 1,200 nautical miles more efficiently. Another striking example is when the European explorers learned from the Taino people in the Caribbean. They adopted indigenous knowledge of local weather patterns and currents, integrating this with their existing navigation techniques to navigate the New World more successfully. However, how did they understand and incorporate these new techniques accurately across linguistic and cultural barriers? This is where the concept of visual demonstration played a crucial role. Even without a common language, showing how a tool was used or how a star was identified could transcend these barriers, enabling crucial knowledge exchange. Cross-cultural navigation exchange reveals how adaptable and collaborative these ancient sailors were, leading us to ponder, with all these tools and techniques, How did they ensure safe passage through the most treacherous waters? This leads us to our final concept, risk management in navigation, also known as maritime contingency planning. Despite all their skills, ancient sailors faced unpredictable dangers. They developed strategies to deal with these, such as maintaining a buffer of supplies and devising emergency protocols. For instance, the ancient Egyptians, when navigating the Nile and nearby Red Sea, prepared extensively for seafaring by bringing extra provisions and establishing a network of support along the way. This strategy allowed them to undertake voyages ranging from 200 to 500 miles, with an added layer of security against the unexpected. Similarly, the Chinese during the Tang Dynasty employed fleet formations that allowed multiple ships to travel together. This not only provided mutual support in case of trouble, but also enhanced their collective ability to interpret environmental cues, effectively covering distance of up to 700 nautical miles. Yet, what of those isolated cases where disaster seemed inevitable? The concept of natural sign memory, where sailors recalled past hazards and environmental changes, helped them avoid repeating previous mistakes. This memory bank of maritime experiences was crucial for survival. Risk management in navigation illustrates the pragmatic side of ancient seafaring, bringing us full circle to the original question: how did these sailors achieve such incredible feats of navigation without our modern maps? Standing once again on that ancient ship's helm, with nothing but the vast ocean and sky, it becomes clear that while they may not have had our modern maps, these sailors possessed a map of a different kind, a profound understanding of the natural world, an intricate web of knowledge passed through generations, and an ability to adapt to the unforeseen. These weren't just voyages. They were masterpieces of human ingenuity, blending observation, tradition, and exchange. It turns out, the map was in their minds all along.